The expedition ship descended into the thick greenish atmosphere of Vron 5, its outer hull creaking as corrosive vapors began licking at the protective plating. Inside the craft, the alien scientists busied themselves with preparations, meticulously calibrating their equipment to withstand the planet's unforgiving environment. Among the group was Dr. Olivia Miller, the sole human participant on the mission, who stood quietly in a corner observing the others. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy of her alien colleagues. Zelvor, the expedition leader, towered over the others with his iridescent blue exoskeleton gleaming under the dim cabin lights, his multiple eyes fixed on Olivia as he addressed the team. As we land on Vron 5, remember the primary objective: observe and evaluate survival capabilities in extreme conditions. We're not here to babysit, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. His gaze lingered on Olivia for a moment longer than necessary, and a faint ripple of amusement ran through the group of aliens. Olivia pretended not to notice. She adjusted her oxygen mask and checked the seals on her lightweight environmental suit. The suit, developed by human engineers, looked almost laughably simplistic compared to the high-tech armor worn by her companions. She had long since grown accustomed to such dismissive attitudes, but knew better than to let them distract her. The shuttle touched down with a jolt, the landing gear sinking slightly into the planet's toxic, sludge-like surface. Outside the window, the landscape stretched endlessly, a desolate expanse of sharp black rocks and bubbling green pools. The air shimmered with heat, and the first drops of acid rain hissed as they struck the craft's hull. "Welcome to Vron 5, Zelvor announced with a smug smile. A planet where even the hardiest species struggle to last more than a few hours unprotected. Shall we see how long the human will survive? His statement elicited a round of chuckles from the others, but Olivia remained impassive. As the shuttle door hissed open, the group moved with practiced efficiency, erecting a temporary observation dome a few meters away. The dome's walls were made of a translucent material that could withstand the acidic atmosphere, providing the scientists with a safe vantage point to observe Olivia's trial. She stepped onto the surface, feeling the subtle pull of the planet's higher-than-average gravity. Her boots sank slightly into the soft ground, but she adjusted quickly, scanning the area with sharp eyes. "Dr. Miller," Zelva called, his voice amplified through the dome speakers, "you'll have 5 minutes to prepare before the rain begins in earnest. Use whatever materials you can find nearby. We'll be monitoring your progress." She nodded and set off without a word, leaving behind the safety of the dome. The air outside was thick and acrid, burning slightly at the edges of her mask. Olivia focused on the task at hand, her mind racing as she analyzed the environment. The ground was littered with jagged rocks, some smooth and glassy, likely formed by ancient volcanic activity. A few hardy plants clung stubbornly to life in crevices, their fibrous stems coated in a shiny, protective film. The aliens watched her through their monitors, their expressions ranging from amused to skeptical. Zelvor leaned back in his chair, confident that Olivia's efforts would amount to nothing. "Humans always think they can adapt to anything," he remarked to his second-in-command, a slender, violet-skinned creature named Janara. "But they lack the sophistication to truly understand environments like this. She'll be begging for help within minutes." Meanwhile, Olivia crouched beside a cluster of rocks, inspecting their composition. She picked up a piece and tapped it against another, listening to the sound it produced. A faint metallic ring confirmed her suspicion. It was a type of silicate that could resist moderate acid exposure. Satisfied, she began collecting more pieces, arranging them into a rough pile. Next, she turned her attention to the plants. Using a small, retractable blade from her suit, she carefully cut away strips of the fibrous material, testing its tensile strength by pulling it taut between her gloved fingers. The fibers held firm, and she allowed herself a small smile. 2 minutes remaining," Zelvor's voice echoed, laced with mock encouragement. Back at the dome, the aliens observed her movements with growing curiosity. "She's not just wandering aimlessly," Janara noted, tilting his head. There's a method to her actions. Zelvor dismissed the comment with a wave of his clawed hand. She's grasping at straws. Even if she constructs something, it won't hold up against the rain. Oblivious to their chatter, Olivia worked quickly, arranging the rocks into a dome-like structure. She used the plant fibers to bind the pieces together, weaving them into a tight mesh that she draped over the top. The final touch was a layer of soil she scooped up with her hands, patting it down to create a seal. It wasn't pretty, but it would serve its purpose. 30 seconds, Zelvor announced, his tone almost gleeful. Olivia stepped back to inspect her creation, making a few last-minute adjustments. As the countdown reached 0, the rain began in earnest. As the acid rain began to pour in earnest, Olivia ducked into the shelter she had hastily constructed. The sound of the rain was deafening, each drop hissing as it struck the ground and sent up tiny plumes of steam. Inside the small structure, the air was stifling and thick, but it was dry. Olivia adjusted her mask to ensure a proper seal and took a moment to steady her breathing. Her muscles ached from the rapid work, but she forced herself to stay focused. This was far from over. From the observation dome, Zelvor and the other scientists stared intently at their monitors. The advanced sensors embedded in their equipment provided real-time data on the external environment as well as Olivia's vitals. Zelvor leaned closer, his mandibles clicking softly in anticipation of her failure. "Her shelter won't last long," he muttered to Janara. "The rain will corrode the materials within." Janara hesitated before responding, his violet skin shimmering under the soft dome lights. "Perhaps. But her vitals are steady. She doesn't seem panicked." Zelvor clicked his tongue in irritation, unwilling to admit even the possibility of a human succeeding where more advanced species had failed. His attention shifted back to the monitor displaying the shelter. The exterior was crude by their standards, a patchwork of rocks, fibers, and soil. Yet it held firm against the relentless downpour. Inside, Olivia was not entirely at ease. While the shelter provided a barrier against the rain, the heat generated by the chemical reactions outside was rising steadily. Her suit's temperature regulators worked to keep her cool, but she knew the system had its limits. She glanced at her wrist display, noting the climbing temperature and calculating how long she could remain inside without succumbing to the heat. The acidic environment presented another challenge. Although her mask filtered out the toxic air, prolonged exposure to the planet's atmosphere could degrade the seals. She checked the edges of her mask carefully, running a gloved finger along the seams to feel for any weakness. Satisfied for the moment, she turned her attention back to the structure. Small rivulets of acidic water began seeping through the outer layer of soil, forming droplets that clung precariously to the fibers above her head. Olivia frowned and reached for the small utility pouch at her waist. She pulled out a tube of adhesive sealant, a standard issue for such missions, and began applying it to the weak spots. Her movements were precise and efficient, honed through years of fieldwork in harsh conditions. The rain intensified, the ground outside turning into a bubbling, toxic mire. Olivia could hear the faint groan of her shelter as the pressure mounted. She worked quickly, reinforcing the interior with additional fibers she had kept in reserve. Her fingers moved deftly, weaving the material into the existing framework. The heat inside the shelter continued to rise, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead, but she refused to stop. At the dome, the scientists observed her every move. Janara's expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity. "She's adapting," he said quietly. "Her methods are crude but effective. She's reinforcing the structure from the inside." Zelvor scoffed, though his eyes remained fixed on the monitor. "A temporary solution at best. The rain will wear her down. Humans lack endurance." Janara didn't respond, his attention fully absorbed by the unfolding scene. He noted how Olivia's movements were calculated, her focus unwavering. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic scrambling often displayed by other species during similar trials. Back inside the shelter, Olivia finished her reinforcements and leaned back against the rough wall. The adhesive had stopped the worst of the leaks, and the additional fibers provided extra support. Still, she knew this was only a stopgap. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the rising heat posed a serious threat. She needed a way to vent the excess temperature without compromising the integrity of the structure. Her eyes scanned the cramped space, searching for anything she could use. She noticed a small crack in the rocky base near her feet, a narrow opening that led into the ground. An idea formed in her mind. If she could channel the hot air through the crack, it might create a natural ventilation system. The risk was significant. If the crack widened, it could destabilize the entire shelter. But she had no choice. Carefully, she widened the crack using the edge of her utility knife, carving a shallow channel that sloped outward. The process was slow and labor-intensive, each movement sending tiny vibrations through the structure. Olivia held her breath, half expecting the shelter to collapse at any moment. When the channel was complete, she stepped back and watched as the hot air began to flow out, replaced by slightly cooler air from below. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to bring the temperature down to a manageable level. At the dome, Zelvor's mandibles twitched in frustration. He could see the temperature inside the shelter stabilizing and the structural integrity holding firm. "She's merely prolonging the inevitable," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Gennaro tilted his head, his golden eyes narrowing. "Perhaps. Or perhaps humans are more resourceful than we gave them credit for." As the rain continued to pour, Olivia allowed herself a brief moment of rest. She closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, blocking out the oppressive heat and the constant hissing of the rain outside. Her mind raced with contingency plans, calculating how to adapt if the situation changed. She knew the scientists were watching her every move, but their opinions were irrelevant. Survival was the only goal. Outside, the acidic landscape writhed under the relentless downpour. Pools of liquid hissed and bubbled, releasing toxic fumes into the air. The observation dome remained untouched, its advanced materials impervious to the hostile environment. Inside, the alien scientists continued their analysis, their opinions divided as the humans' resilience defied their expectations. For Olivia, the trial was far from over. She had bought herself time, but the true test was yet to come. Vecron 5 was an unyielding adversary, and she knew it would take more than ingenuity to overcome its challenges. As she sat in the dim, stifling shelter, her thoughts turned to the next step. Failure was not an option. The rain showed no sign of stopping, the downpour intensifying as the hours dragged on. Inside her shelter, Olivia shifted uncomfortably, the confined space pressing down on her. She knew that even with her makeshift ventilation system, the prolonged exposure to Vecron 5's harsh conditions would eventually push her body and her suit to their limits. Her wrist display showed a steady rise in humidity within the structure, and the adhesive sealant was beginning to weaken at critical points. Time was running out, and she needed to think fast. Her mind raced through options, each one more dangerous than the last. Staying inside would guarantee safety from the rain, but would risk suffocation or structural collapse if the shelter's integrity gave way. Venturing outside was unthinkable without a solid plan. She glanced at the crack she had carved into the ground, an idea forming in her mind. Perhaps the solution wasn't above her, but below. Olivia activated her suit's environmental scanner, directing it toward the fissure. The display lit up with readings, indicating that the ground beneath her was porous and riddled with natural channels. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. If she could expand the fissure and create a passage deep enough to escape the rain's reach, she might be able to wait out the storm underground. The idea was risky. Any mistake could cause the tunnel to collapse, burying her alive, but it was the only viable option. Outside, the observation dome buzzed with activity. Zelvor's frustration was palpable as he reviewed the data streams coming from Olivia's suit. Her vitals remained steady, and her movements, though slowed by the oppressive conditions, showed no sign of panic. "She's merely delaying the inevitable," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "The rain will erode her shelter, and she'll have no choice but to surrender. Gennara, seated nearby, studied the readings with a furrowed brow. "She's scanning the ground," he noted. "Perhaps she's considering an escape route." Xivor scoffed, dismissing the idea with a wave of his clawed hand. "The soil on Vecron 5 is too unstable for excavation. She'll collapse the structure on herself if she tries." Gennara said nothing, his golden eyes narrowing as he continued to observe. There was something about Olivia's methodical approach that intrigued him. Unlike other participants who had succumbed to panic or recklessness under similar conditions, she displayed a calm determination that was both unusual and impressive. Inside the shelter, Olivia began her work. Using her utility knife and a small collapsible spade from her gear, she carefully widened the fissure. Each movement was deliberate, her hands steady despite the growing fatigue in her muscles. The heat inside the shelter was oppressive, and her suit's cooling system hummed faintly, struggling to keep her core temperature stable. She worked quickly, her mind focused on the task at hand. As she dug, the fissure widened into a shallow tunnel, its walls slick with moisture from the rising humidity. Olivia paused to assess her progress, adjusting the angle of the tunnel to ensure stability. She knew that one wrong move could cause the entire structure to cave in, but she pushed the thought aside. Fear was a distraction she couldn't afford. Her wrist display beeped, alerting her to a sudden drop in oxygen levels. The air inside the shelter was growing thin, the small ventilation system unable to keep up with the increased demand. Olivia gritted her teeth, her heart pounding as she realized the urgency of her situation. The tunnel had to be completed soon or she wouldn't make it. The scientists in the observation dome watched in tense silence as Olivia's movements became more frantic. Xivor leaned forward, his mandibles clicking softly. "She's digging herself into a grave," he muttered. "This is the end." Gennara's expression remained neutral, though his tone carried a hint of admiration. "Perhaps. Or perhaps she knows something we don't." Xivor shot him a sharp glance, but said nothing, his attention drawn back to the monitor. The human's persistence was beginning to unsettle him, though he refused to show it. Back in the tunnel, Olivia finally broke through to a larger cavity below. A faint rush of cooler air greeted her, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp stone. She scanned the cavity with her wrist display, confirming that it was stable enough to enter. Without hesitation, she squeezed through the narrow opening, her body protesting as she maneuvered into the cramped space. The cavity was barely large enough for her to crouch, its walls slick and uneven. Olivia adjusted her position, her breathing shallow as she tried to conserve oxygen. The faint light from her suit illuminated the space, revealing veins of a strange, crystalline material embedded in the rock. She reached out to touch one, her gloved fingers brushing against its smooth surface. The material was cool to the touch, and a faint vibration pulsed beneath her hand. Her scanner beeped, displaying unfamiliar readings. The crystals emitted a low-level energy signature, one that seemed to resonate with her suit's systems. Olivia frowned, intrigued but cautious. She activated her data recorder, documenting the discovery for later analysis. Whatever this material was, it could be significant. Above her, the rain continued to pour, the acidic deluge eroding the surface with relentless force. The shelter she had built was no longer visible, swallowed by the bubbling muck. Olivia's decision to move underground had been timely, but she knew she couldn't stay here indefinitely. The cavity offered temporary respite, but it wouldn't protect her from the long-term dangers of Vecron 5. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden tremor, the ground beneath her shifting slightly. Olivia froze, her hand gripping the wall for support. The tremor subsided as quickly as it had begun, but it left her uneasy. She checked her scanner, noting a spike in seismic activity. The planet was unstable, and she would need to move soon. In the observation dome, Xilvor's frustration boiled over. "She's delaying the inevitable," he snapped, his voice rising. "No one has ever survived Vecron 5 for this long. She's merely prolonging her failure." Gennara remained calm, his gaze fixed on the monitors. "Perhaps, but she's achieved more than any of us expected. That alone is worth noting." Zelvor glared at him, his mandibles twitching with irritation. "You sound impressed." Janara met his gaze evenly. "I am." Olivia, unaware of the growing tension among the scientists, focused on her next steps. The energy readings from the crystals offered a glimmer of hope, but she needed more information. Her survival depended not only on her resourcefulness but also on her ability to adapt to the planet's unique challenges. With a deep breath, she activated her suit's energy scanner and began analyzing the crystals in earnest, determined to find a way forward. The battle against Vron 5 was far from over, but Olivia was not one to back down. She had faced impossible odds before, and she would face them again. Failure was not an option. Olivia knelt in the narrow cavity, her scanner humming softly as it processed the readings from the crystalline material embedded in the walls. The low-level energy signature it emitted was unlike anything she had encountered before. Her display flickered with data, showing patterns that hinted at a potential source of power or, at the very least, something capable of stabilizing the fragile environment around her. She narrowed her eyes, focusing on the task, her fingers moving deftly across the controls on her wrist unit. The crystals vibrated faintly under her touch, and for a moment the damp, oppressive air inside the cavity seemed to lighten. Her suit's systems detected a subtle shift in atmospheric composition, a faint trace of oxygen mingling with the otherwise toxic air. Olivia's pulse quickened as she realized the crystals were not just passive formations, but actively interacting with their surroundings. This discovery could mean survival, not just for her, but potentially for anyone brave or foolish enough to explore Vron 5 in the future. A sudden tremor shook the ground, the vibrations reverberating through the confined space. Olivia braced herself against the wall, her gloved hands gripping the rock as loose debris tumbled around her. The tremor subsided quickly, but it left a sharp reminder of the planet's instability. She checked her scanner again, noting an increase in seismic activity. Time was no longer a luxury she could afford. "Focus," she whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible through the mask. She activated a small cutting tool from her utility belt, carefully extracting a shard of the crystal. The tool emitted a faint beam of light, precise and steady as it separated the shard from the larger formation. Olivia held her breath, watching as the shard broke free with a soft chime, the vibration momentarily intensifying before settling. The extracted piece continued to emit its faint glow, pulsing rhythmically in her hand. Olivia tucked the shard into a secure compartment in her suit and turned her attention back to her surroundings. The cavity, though stable for now, was not a long-term solution. She needed to find a way to harness the energy from the crystals and use it to reinforce her position, or better yet, create a path to safety. Her thoughts raced, piecing together fragments of possibilities as she scanned the rest of the chamber. Above her, in the observation dome, Zelvor's irritation had given way to a grim fascination. He leaned forward, his multiple eyes fixed on the monitor displaying Olivia's vitals and environmental readings. "She's collecting samples," he remarked, his tone laced with disbelief. "Does she truly think those crystals will save her?" Jainara, standing beside him, studied the same data with quiet intensity. "The crystals are resonating with her suit's systems," he observed. "It's as if they're responding to her presence." Zelvor scoffed, though his focus never wavered from the screen. "Coincidence, nothing more. The human is grasping at straws." "Perhaps," Janara replied, his voice calm but firm. "Or perhaps she's onto something we've overlooked." Inside the cavity, Olivia worked quickly, her movements precise despite the fatigue that weighed heavily on her. She used the shard she had collected to test the stability of the chamber, pressing it against various points in the rock. Each time, the shard pulsed faintly, emitting a low hum that seemed to resonate with the surrounding material. The hum grew louder as she approached a particular section of the wall, the vibrations intensifying until the shard glowed brighter than before. Curious, Olivia pressed her hand against the glowing section of the wall. The vibrations coursed through her glove, a steady rhythm that seemed almost alive. Her scanner beeped, displaying an influx of energy readings far higher than anything it had detected before. She frowned, her mind racing to interpret the data. The readings suggested that this section of the wall contained a concentrated cluster of the crystals, their energy potential far greater than she had anticipated. She activated her cutting tool again, this time aiming to expose more of the cluster. The tool's beam cut through the rock with ease, revealing a network of crystals embedded deep within the wall. The glow from the cluster illuminated the cavity, casting eerie shadows that danced across the damp surfaces. Olivia stepped back, her eyes widening as the crystal's energy began to interact with her suit's systems, causing her display to flicker. The interaction wasn't random. Her suit's environmental filters began to stabilize, and her oxygen levels evened out. The crystals were actively enhancing her suit's functionality, compensating for the harsh conditions of Vron 5. Olivia's mind raced as she realized the implications. If she could integrate the crystal's energy into her suit's systems, she might be able to create a protective field strong enough to shield her from the acid rain. But the process would be risky. Her suit wasn't designed to handle such an energy source, and any miscalculation could result in catastrophic failure. Olivia weighed her options, her heart pounding. She could stay in the cavity and hope the crystal's passive effects would be enough to sustain her, or she could take the gamble and attempt to harness their full potential. She chose the latter. Using her scanner, Olivia mapped out the energy flow within the cluster, identifying the most stable points of resonance. She adjusted her suit's settings, rerouting power to create a temporary interface with the crystals. Her fingers moved quickly, her focus absolute as she configured the connection. The suit hummed softly, its systems adapting to the influx of energy. The moment the connection stabilized, a surge of power coursed through her suit. Olivia gasped, the intensity of the energy overwhelming her senses for a brief moment. Her display flickered wildly before settling, the readouts showing a dramatic improvement in environmental stability. The crystal's energy had created a localized field around her, neutralizing the acidic elements in the air and stabilizing the temperature. Olivia exhaled slowly, her body trembling from the adrenaline rush. She had done it. The crystal's energy had given her a fighting chance, but the question remained, how long would it last? She couldn't stay underground forever, and the observation dome was still out of reach. Her thoughts were interrupted by another tremor, this one stronger than before. The ground beneath her shifted violently, and cracks spidered across the walls of the cavity. Olivia's heart raced as she realized the structure was on the verge of collapse. She had to move, now. Clutching the glowing shard in her hand, Olivia scrambled toward the tunnel she had carved earlier. The walls groaned ominously as chunks of rock began to fall, the tremors growing more intense with each passing second. She moved quickly, her suit's enhanced systems providing a level of agility she hadn't experienced before. As she emerged into the open, the acidic rain hissed against the glowing field surrounding her. The crystal's energy held strong, repelling the rain and creating a protective barrier. Olivia didn't stop to admire her work. Her focus was on survival, her mind already calculating the next move. Back in the dome, Zelvor stared at the monitor in stunned silence. "She's outside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and she's unharmed." Jinara smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "Perhaps the human has more to teach us than we realized." Olivia pressed forward, the rain pounding against the barrier as she made her way toward the horizon. The battle against Vron 5 was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. The acid rain hammered relentlessly against the protective field generated by the crystalline energy embedded in Olivia's suit. Each drop sizzled and evaporated as it met the barrier, creating a halo of steam around her as she trudged forward. Her muscles ached, and her breaths came in sharp, controlled gasps, but she forced herself to keep moving. The desolate landscape of Vron 5 stretched endlessly ahead, broken only by jagged rocks and bubbling pools of toxic liquid. Her wrist display projected a map of the terrain, scanning for the faint energy signatures she had detected earlier near the crystalline cluster. If her calculations were correct, There might be a larger deposit of crystals nearby, one strong enough to amplify the protective field and possibly create a stable escape route. The stakes were high, but Olivia had no other choice. She was running out of time, and the storm showed no signs of abating. In the observation dome, the tension was palpable. Zelvor's mandibles clicked rapidly as he monitored the live feed from Olivia's suit. The readings were astonishing. Her vitals were steady, and the energy field surrounding her remained stable despite the punishing conditions. He refused to believe what he was seeing, his pride battling with the undeniable evidence before him. "How is this possible?" he muttered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "No one has ever survived this long on Vecron 5. Junara, standing beside him, observed the data with quiet fascination. "She's using the crystals," he said, his tone even. "Their energy is sustaining her. It's remarkable." Zelva shot him a glare, unwilling to admit that the humans' ingenuity had outpaced their advanced technology. "It's reckless," he snapped. "She's gambling with forces she doesn't fully understand. One misstep and it will all collapse." Janara didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the screen, his golden eyes narrowing as Olivia's path brought her closer to a particularly unstable section of terrain. The ground ahead was riddled with fissures, and the seismic activity was growing more erratic. If she wasn't careful, the entire area could collapse beneath her. Oblivious to the debate unfolding in the dome, Olivia pressed on. Her display beeped, signaling a significant energy spike just beyond a cluster of jagged rocks. She quickened her pace, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, acidic ground with each step. As she rounded the rocks, she came to an abrupt halt, her eyes widening at the sight before her. A massive crystalline structure jutted out of the ground, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. The formation pulsed rhythmically, emitting waves of energy that resonated with the shard in her suit. The field around her intensified, growing brighter and more stable as she stepped closer. Olivia felt a surge of hope. This was it, the key to her survival, and possibly the answer to unlocking Vecron 5's mysteries. She approached the structure cautiously, her scanner working overtime to analyze the energy flow. The readings were unlike anything she had seen before, a complex interplay of frequencies and patterns that hinted at a level of sophistication far beyond natural formation. Olivia's mind raced as she considered the implications. The crystals weren't just a resource. They were alive, or at least operating on a level that mimicked sentience. As she reached out to touch the structure, a sudden tremor shook the ground. Olivia stumbled, catching herself against the base of the crystal. The vibration intensified, and cracks began to spider across the terrain. Her scanner blared a warning, and she realized with a sinking feeling that the energy she had tapped into was destabilized. "Come on, think," she muttered, her voice muffled by the mask. She had to find a way to harness the energy without triggering a catastrophic collapse. Her eyes darted across the scanner display, searching for a solution. The crystal's energy field was strongest at its core, but accessing it would require rerouting her suit's systems entirely. It was a gamble, but there was no alternative. Olivia adjusted the controls on her wrist, her hands moving with practiced precision despite the growing urgency. She rerouted power from her suit's auxiliary systems, creating a direct interface with the crystal. The connection established instantly, and a surge of energy flooded her suit, amplifying the protective field to an almost blinding intensity. The rain evaporated on contact, and the ground beneath her feet stabilized, the cracks receding as the energy field extended outward. In the dome, Zelvor stared at the monitor in stunned silence. "She's stabilizing the terrain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, there was no mockery or disdain in his tone, only awe. Junara smiled faintly, his respect for the human growing with each passing moment. "She's not just surviving," he said. "She's adapting." The energy field continued to expand, creating a dome of stability around the crystalline structure. Olivia stood at its center, her suit's systems fully integrated with the crystal's energy flow. She felt a strange connection to the structure, as if it were guiding her actions, its rhythms syncing with her own. For the first time since landing on Vecron 5, she felt a sense of control, but the victory was short-lived. Her scanner detected a massive spike in seismic activity beneath the surface. The energy she had harnessed was triggering a chain reaction, and the ground began to tremble violently. Olivia's heart pounded as she realized the crystal was reaching a critical state. If it shattered, the resulting energy release could destroy everything within miles. She had to act fast. Olivia disengaged her suit from the crystal, severing the connection just as the tremors reached their peak. The ground beneath her buckled, and she sprinted toward a nearby ridge, the energy field protecting her from the collapsing terrain. Behind her, the crystal emitted a blinding flash of light, followed by a deafening roar as it fractured, releasing a massive wave of energy. The shock wave sent Olivia tumbling, but her protective field absorbed the brunt of the impact. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes widening as she looked back. The crystal was gone, replaced by a massive crater, its edges glowing faintly with residual energy. The rain had stopped, the once toxic air now eerily still. In the dome, Zelvor and Janara watched in stunned silence as the monitors displayed the aftermath. The energy readings had stabilized, and the planet's atmosphere was beginning to show signs of recovery. "She did it," Janara said softly, his admiration for Olivia clear. Zelvor said nothing, his pride too wounded to admit defeat. But in his silence there was a grudging respect for the human who had accomplished the impossible. Olivia stood at the edge of the crater, her body trembling with exhaustion but her spirit unbroken. She had not only survived Vecron 5, but had uncovered its secrets and proved the resilience of humanity. As she gazed at the horizon, she felt a sense of triumph that no storm could ever extinguish.